I've tried to make it a habit to talk about at least one new anime every season, but today I figured I'd take you back in time to the very first anime I ever saw. Minus points if you thought it was some generic shonen. Pokemon would have been a good guess though, but in reality it is the Moomins, or tanoshii muumin ikka in Japanese, or to give it the name I knew it by, Muumilaakson tarinoita. One of the very few anime ever written by a Finnish person, well, sort of. Yes, strictly speaking, Tove Janson did not write the anime, but she is the creator of the Moomins, the anime of which is heavily based on her writings, and impressively she's probably the first openly LGBTQ celebrity in Finland, having been born all the way back in 1914, but I'm not here to give you her autobiography or anything, and I presume you aren't here for that either, since it's a video about the Moomin anime. And no, not the somewhat bizarre 1969 version, but the one from 1990, and yes, that does mean that it's a show even older than I am. And on the note of being old, no, not me, the show, there's a hefty dose of nostalgia coming with this one, you know, the feeling you got when getting back into old school RuneScape that fooled you into thinking that catching lobsters and Kramja was actually somehow fun, yeah, that one. So don't expect anything even vaguely objective from a purely review standpoint, since this is a show that shaped not only mine, but the childhood of most Finnish children throughout the 90s, and probably still does to this day, as it is a major part of our national identity. Speaking of nostalgia, in an effort to give this some semblance of credibility, I did re-watch the show for about a millionth time to make sure it's not just the yearning for those blissful days of childhood speaking. But what are the Moomins and why am I talking about them, aside from the obvious Finnishness of course? Well, it all started in the 1930s, when a young Tove Janson drew a character on the wall of an outhouse, and here I said I wasn't going to do an autobiography. But bear with me a second, as the Moomins are a core part of Finnishness, I feel a brief background explanation is in order to get us on the same page here. Also, since we're on the topic of the author, there's a weirdly pervasive misconception, one that I keep running into even here in Finland, stating that Tove Janson was a Swedish man, which she evidently wasn't. But that's not really important, and so to speedrun the complex and rather long rise to fame of the Moomins, they began as books that practically nobody read, as there was a little thing called World War II going on, but in the late 1940s these publications began to gain popularity, after which the Moomins slowly spread to comics with rather more adult themes that we might be used to in this day and age, covering everything from funny adventures to alcohol abuse, and eventually the popularity of the adorable hippo-like Moomin spread them to every form of pop culture, even in far-off Japan, culminating with the Moomin anime, which covers 104 episodes worth of story. Important note here, not every episode has been shown everywhere, but there are 104 in total, so you might need to do some googling and potentially sailing off the high seas to find them all. Hell, it took nigh on 20 years for the last 3 episodes to be shown here, but even if you are missing some, that's not the end of the world, as while there are some longer arcs, both in the anime itself as well as in the form of the movie adaptations like The Comet in Moominland, the anime predominantly focuses on a rather more slice-of-life style of storytelling, of covering small self-contained parts of the life in the Moominvale, from the perspective of the Moomins and their extended family naturally. Although some episodes do focus on other inhabitants of the valley as well as some adventures outside of it too, most notably the arc revolving around an old sewing machine turned time machine, which involves adventures as far-flung as ancient Egypt and the Wild West. There's also the Moomin's adventure out to sea on a refurbished boat, which incidentally happens to be my favourite arc. Also, at this point, I feel it prudent to mention, I obviously know everything about the Moomins in Finnish, so if I make mistakes with the English names or anything along those lines, I'll try my best to be a good editor boy and add notes, but if I do miss something, do let me know in the comments below. So yes, the Moomins, the anime and the movies, I guess we're covering both as they kind of go hand in hand. At least some of the movies do, as when you get a franchise this big, someone's bound to do a Disney at one point or another. So yes, the stories in the anime, while not directly written by Tove herself, are heavily based on her writings, so much so that to Moomin fans, for a story to be canon, it had to have originated from Tove herself, either in the full-blown novels or adapted from her more child-friendly cartoons, so fret not, you aren't about to see Moomin Bappa making moonshine and become a booze runner in all of its animated glory. A bit of a shame that it could have been fun. But even so, the Moomins aren't without their more grown-up themes as well, chiefly focused around horror-esque elements, with the Groke having traumatized kids everywhere for decades, and the ghost ship saga still being brought up in discussions of childhood horror experiences that cause anxiety to some well into their adult life. There's also the story of Moomin Papa's childhood, which can get a tad rough at times, mainly with abandonment and some of the more dangerous encounters he had as a wee little Moomin. But as a whole, the anime focuses on wacky adventures, fun and educational stories, drawing both from Tove Jansson's stories based on her own life with the events and people she encountered, as well as purely fictional tales all adapted into the charming style of the Moomins. While the anime itself has some very slice-of-life-esque elements of just living, and as much as I might enjoy the more adventurous segments of it, I genuinely feel like it's in the educational arcs that the Moomins truly shine, and in a way, that is what makes it more than just a story. I've often heard the show being compared to the way Ghibli films are constructed to reflect on broader topics that touch people's lives on the daily, which in turn makes the fantastical in them relatable in a way that a pure fantasy story full of magic and explosions could never do. But whereas Ghibli films focus more on grand social commentary of overarching problems with our society, like war or nature struggle against human innovation, the Moomins tend to look inwards into how a single person's selfless actions can change another's perspective of the world, reflecting on the personal nature of Jansson's writings. Now, obviously, as unfortunate as it is, I don't have a time machine with which to wish myself back in time to talk with the author herself, so like your middle school teacher asking you to write a 7-page essay on the deeper allegorical meaning behind the goddamn door in Edgar Allan Poe's Raven, I shall now extrapolate, as in with the meaning and purpose of said educational stories in the Moomins. And because it is the first one that came to mind, and probably one of the more obvious ones, we shall first look at this from the perspective of the story of Nini, the Invisible Girl. Nini had turned invisible as a result of bad treatment, and when she comes to the Moomins, they decide to help her, and slowly with them accepting her and just being generally decent people towards her, Nini begins to gain back her visible form, this being a fairly self-explanatory reflection on the effects of bullying and the need to be accepted for a person to be who they really are, lest they disappear completely as an individual, and while, at least to my knowledge, she never expressly said it, I'd be surprised if Nini's experience wasn't based on Jansson's own life growing up as a lesbian woman in the times she did. A notion which is further reinforced by the fact that some of the warmest and most welcoming characters in the story are partially or in their entirety based on real people with whom Tove Jansson had a particularly close and accepting relationship with, chief amongst whom is Tuutikki. Yes, that's the Finnish pronunciation. I think the English it's a CK rather than a double consonant, but that's not important. It just sounded wrong in my head trying to pronounce it in a different way. Anyway, she's based on Jansson's great love in life, Tuulikki Pietilä, being arguably the most compassionate character in the entire Moomin franchise and the one most likely to provide sage and life-changing advice to those in need. She also plays a key role in letting the Moomins know how kindness can cure Nini's invisibility, and now you'll hopefully see where I was going with the extrapolation. Of course, this is still just conjecture, as again, without a hefty dose of fantasy magic, asking the author herself for confirmation is a tad difficult, but I hope I got even roughly into the right ballpark. Still, Nini's is not the only story of this nature. The entirety of the Moomins are full of little tales of both helping one's neighbor, all the way to obsession over perfection, and even commentary on greed and how it can drive people away, with the arc about Aunt Jane. Another story I wanted to specifically mention from the Moomins is the one concerning Tingumi and Bob. Okay, I've never looked into their English names, and these were a bit of a shock, but it makes sense when you look into the name's origins. Anyway, the two of them arrive in the Moomin Vale with a great jewel hidden in a suitcase that nobody is allowed to look into, and when you factor in the two of them being a reflection of Tove herself and her brief love Vivica Bandler, it becomes very obvious as to what the great treasure that must be kept hidden from the world is. Not only because Tove herself expressed this to be the case, so for once I don't even need that time machine. Still, based on Jansson's own revelations about including her experiences as well as previous conjecture by yours truly, one could read it as the author using her own life as a framing device for the Moomins. Of course, such an approach to seeing the author's experience as one of the chief driving forces behind if not all, then at least some of the stories, is a somewhat dated approach to textual analysis when it comes to the actual scientific paradigm of it. Oh God, why did I write that? That is literally in my script. This is the kind of quality of videos you get when I'm studying while I'm writing these. Nobody cares about the scientific paradigm of textual analysis. Anyway, moving swiftly onwards. Obviously, the Moomins are not just a reflection of the people Tove knew or the author herself, and yet, presumably even the fully fictional characters from the Moomin family to their neighbors, friends and acquaintances reflect a believably human world despite their outward appearance that, let's face it, doesn't exactly reflect us. Regardless of which, you'll find some of the most relatable characters in here, not because they look like you or I, at least I hope not. It's also not because they lead the life of fantasy that you dreamed of as a child, but because they live a life of their own, full of fantastically mundane problems in an environment that is both far removed from reality and oddly grounded in its familiarity. It feels like a lived life, and that's a rare thing in anime these days. Hell, it's been rare in anime for a while, as the medium tends to focus more on catering to fantasies as a form of escapism. Why else would shonen and isekai be among the most popular anime genres these days, and well, for at least the past 10 if not 20 years? And yes, it's not like anime is the only form of pop culture to do this. After all, we all need a little something to take the edge off of the reality of being inconsequential specks in this truly uncaring universe we call home. But it doesn't always have to be an edgelord saying "arise" or whatever the fuck happens in Solo Leveling or any other popular shonen these days. Sometimes all you need is a little bit of someone else having equally mundane problems as you do in a beautiful and fantastical world. But that's not the only thing the Moomins does that is rare in anime these days, the other being its art. The thing with having been made well over 30 years ago is that everything in the Moomin anime is hand-drawn. Now, I'm not an artist, as is probably painfully obvious by the editing in this video alone, and I didn't even draw any of this, I just flailed around to compile it into something vaguely video-shaped, so I'll be the first to admit that no, I probably can't fully appreciate the level of artistry and work that goes into hand-drawing an entire 100+ episode series, in which I'd suspect I'm more like the average viewer instead of being able to offer a deeply seated understanding of the technical complexity of what I see, but hey, every now and then you just need an opinion of an idiot that is no more informed than you are, and that I am more than happy to provide. Also, yes, this is absolutely a part where I say is heavily colored by nostalgia, pun not intended, so your mileage may vary. I really like the style of the Moomins. It's highly stylized, as is Janson's art, but not to a point where it would take time to get used to, like, say, One Piece. But it's still so unique that you will be instantly able to tell if something's from the Moomins, mainly down to the character appearances. But for me, what I really love about the visual execution of the Moomins are the backgrounds, which neatly loops back to the aforementioned comparison with Ghibli films. That hand-drawn or watercolor painted, I honestly couldn't tell which it is at times, background just brings a level of timeless charm to everything, which further emphasizes the grounded nature of the Moomins and their world, from simply how things look like to the choice of color palette to reflect the theme of each scene. There's no My Hero everything is midday bright even in the secret underground lair of the evil bad guy. Everything seems natural, and while there's a time and a place for Egghead arc style almost neon bright colors, this is not it. And the muted, sometimes pastel-esque hues you'll find in the Moomin Vale just look natural. Interestingly, and on a completely unrelated note, there is a version of The Hobbit illustrated by Janson which somehow manages to convey a similar feeling of Moomin-ness to Tolkien's work, which, if anything, goes to show the power such a unique art style can hold over general feeling of a work. Normally at the end here I'd talk a little bit about the music and the various voice acting performances from the Japanese to the English dub, but as everything I said about the visuals also holds true with the music, from the timelessness to fitting the scenes perfectly, I won't start repeating myself for the sake of an argument. As for the voice acting, it's complicated. For me, the only correct language of the Moomins is the 90s Finnish dub of it, because that's what I grew up on, and everything else just sounds off. I have a preconceived notion as to what each of the characters sounds like, and if they don't, well, then it's not Moomins for me. That's not to say that the Japanese version, for example, would sound bad, far from it. It's an excellent piece of voice acting work from talented people, but it's not my Moomins. Hopefully you get what I'm trying to say here, as while I would normally advocate for consuming any piece of media in its original language, if that's at all possible for you, aka maybe don't read a book in German if you don't speak German, but with anime, subbed is the closest to the original vision as you can get, assuming you can read of course, but there's a level of nostalgia and what you're used to that needs to be taken into account, especially when it comes to something that you've grown up with. Obviously, this depends on the level of execution of the original. Certain unnamed Finnish dub comes to mind, Digimon. You'll know if you'll know. All of this being a long and complicated way of saying that you should absolutely watch the Moomins in the Swedish version, as Tove's mother's tongue was Swedish. Just kidding. And with that terrible excuse for a joke, thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this. It turned out to be much harder to write about something I know as intimately as the Moomins, hence why this video took well over a month to make. Yes, my bi-weekly upload plan is going swimmingly, what do you mean? And especially big thanks goes to my channel members, RC Rally, Rage and Mr. Shadow. If you would like to support the channel, you can always become a member. If not, that's perfectly okay too. Subscribe for more anime goodness, on which note, I am trying to hit 5,000 subs this year, so if you did enjoy this, do consider hitting that button. There's also a Patreon, but YouTube is a bit iffy with promoting it. Anyway, with this, I've been Cheese, and I hope to see you next time. Ta-ta for now.